There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around without questioning it. It lives in the films, in the museum exhibits, in the documentary footage of helicopters descending into jungle clearings. It exists in the vocabulary people use when they talk about it. Words like tragedy and quagmire and mistake. That version of the war is not entirely wrong. But it is also not the version that the men who fought it actually experienced. And it is not the version that the government actually ran. The word mistake implies an error in judgment made by people who were otherwise trying to do the right thing. The word tragedy implies something inevitable, something almost literary, a grand arc with a meaningful conclusion. Neither word captures what the Vietnam War actually was at the operational level, in the field, in the briefing rooms, in the classified cables that were never declassified, and the reports that were quietly filed and never acted upon. The more accurate framework is not misunderstanding, it is misrepresentation. And the difference between those two things matters enormously, because misunderstanding can be corrected with better information, while misrepresentation is a structural problem, something built into the system itself, something that continued producing false outputs, even when the people inside the system knew the outputs were false. This is not a story about villains. It is not a story about heroes either. It is a story about how an institution can continue operating long after the internal logic that justified it has collapsed. How soldiers can continue fighting long after the mission has become undefined. How reports can continue being filed long after anyone believes what is written in them. It is a story about the specific texture of a war that went on for years inside a kind of institutional fog, where the official version and the lived reality diverged so completely that the people responsible for bridging that gap eventually stopped trying. What follows covers ground that did not make it into the standard histories, not because it was too obscure to find, but because it was inconvenient to include. The military classified what it needed to classify and downplayed what it could not classify. The press reported what it could access and sanitized what it feared would not be believed. The government told the public what it needed the public to believe, and told itself a different story in private. And the soldiers, the ones who actually walked through the villages and the river deltas and the triple canopy jungle, they knew a third version entirely, one that matched neither the official briefings nor the newspaper headlines. Begin with the body count, not as a number, but as a system. By 1966, the body count had become the primary metric of success in Vietnam. Not territory held, not political stability achieved, not infrastructure built or populations protected. The number of enemy dead. General William Westmoreland believed that if American forces could kill enough North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, the enemy would eventually reach a breaking point, a crossover moment where attrition would exceed replacement capacity and the war would effectively be won. It was a theory of victory built entirely around mathematics, and the mathematics were fabricated almost from the beginning. The pressure to produce high body counts came from the top and flowed downward through every layer of the chain of command. Commanders who reported high counts received praise and advancement. Commanders who reported low counts were questioned, scrutinized, sometimes relieved of their positions. The incentive structure was not subtle, and so the numbers were inflated, consistently, systematically. Not through a single directive, but through 1,000 small decisions made by officers and NCOs and enlisted men who understood what the numbers meant for their careers and their units. A dead farmer found near a firefight became an enemy combatant. Civilian casualties were reclassified. Wounded fighters who were finished off were counted as enemy killed in action. Double counting occurred across unit boundaries. In some cases, the same body was counted multiple times as different units rotated through an area. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam, known as MACV, received these numbers, aggregated them, and transmitted them upward as evidence of progress. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had spent his career at Ford Motor Company applying systems analysis to industrial production, received the numbers and believed them, or chose to believe them, or believed in them as a kind of professional obligation. The war was being managed, the metrics were being tracked. The crossover point would come. It never came. And the people inside the system who knew it would never come were not, for the most part, the ones being listened to. Daniel Ellsberg had worked for the Rand Corporation and the Defense Department. He had been in Vietnam himself, had walked the countryside with troops, had spoken with village chiefs and provincial officials and lower-ranking officers who said things in private that bore no resemblance to what they reported upward. When he returned to the United States, he carried with him a slowly developing understanding that the war was not being lost, despite the effort being made to win it. It was being lost because the effort to win it was based on a false picture of reality that the system was actively generating and maintaining. The Pentagon Papers, which Ellsberg eventually leaked to the press in 1971, documented this in exhaustive detail. But the papers covered policy decisions and strategic assessments. They did not fully capture the texture of what was happening at ground level, in the small units, in the villages, in the spaces where the war was actually conducted. That texture is documented elsewhere in court-martial records, in congressional testimony, in after-action reports that were classified for decades, in the accounts of veterans who spent years trying to get people to listen. Go back to 1967. A young Army officer named Colin Powell was serving his first tour in Vietnam with the 23rd Infantry Division, later known as the Americal Division. Powell's unit was operating in Quang Province. In his memoir, written decades later, Powell described the province as a place where it was difficult to tell friend from enemy, where the population's relationship to the war was ambiguous at best and openly hostile at worst. What Powell did not fully describe in his memoir, though it emerged through other investigations, was the broader context of how his division operated in that province. The Americal Division had a culture. It was a culture shaped by pressure, by casualty rates, by the difficulty of fighting a war where the enemy wore no uniform and the terrain offered no fixed objectives. It was a culture that by 1968 would produce My Lai. But My Lai did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from a pattern of behavior that had been building for months, from an accumulation of smaller actions that were never investigated, never reported accurately, never fed back into the system as data that might have changed the trajectory. My Lai is known. What is less known is the internal cover-up that followed it, and less known still is how long that cover-up succeeded. On March 16, 1968, soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, entered the hamlet of My Lai 4 in Quang Province. They had been told the hamlet was a Viet Cong stronghold. They encountered no resistance. They killed between 350 and 500 unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. They burned the village. They destroyed livestock. The operation was logged as a military success. The body count reported was enemy killed in action. The Army's own initial investigation found nothing to be concerned about. The matter might have ended there. It nearly did. What broke it open was not an institutional mechanism. It was a single soldier named Ron Riddenhauer, who had not been at My Lai himself but had heard accounts from soldiers who were. He spent months after returning from Vietnam writing letters to congressmen, to the Pentagon, to the State Department. He wrote 30 letters. Most were ignored. One eventually reached a journalist named Seymour Hersh, who broke the story in November 1969, a year and 8 months after the massacre had occurred. During those 20 months, the Army had been aware that something significant had happened. The cover-up was not perfect, but it was effective enough, long enough, to allow the war to continue without the public having to confront what was being done in their name. The subsequent investigation, led by General William Peers, produced a report of extraordinary detail and condemnation. The Peers report documented not just what had happened at My Lai, but the extensive efforts to suppress knowledge of it at multiple levels of command. It identified specific officers who had received information about the killings and had chosen to discard it or bury it. It recommended charges against 28 officers and enlisted men. Of those, only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He served 3 years under house arrest. The men who had covered it up, the officers who had falsified the reports, The commanders who had failed to investigate faced no legal consequences. The Piers report itself was classified. It was not released publicly in full until 1974, and even after its release, the broader questions it raised about systemic accountability went largely unanswered. The Army commissioned reviews. The reviews produced recommendations. The recommendations were filed. The war in Vietnam was not one war. It was several wars being conducted simultaneously in the same geography, often by different parts of the American military and intelligence apparatus with different objectives, different rules of engagement, and different definitions of success that were sometimes mutually contradictory. The conventional war, the one involving large unit operations, search and destroy missions, fire support bases and artillery, was the one most visible to the public. But underneath it, and often in direct tension with it, was a different conflict being conducted by the CIA, by special forces units operating under intelligence control, by provincial reconnaissance units whose activities were classified and whose chain of command ran not through the military hierarchy, but through the pacification apparatus. The most significant of these programs was known as the Phoenix Program. It was designed to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political and administrative network that sustained the insurgency. Neutralize was the operational term. In practice, it meant capture, defection, or killing. The program was run jointly by the CIA and the South Vietnamese government, with American advisors embedded at the provincial level. The Phoenix program produced statistics. By 1972, it claimed to have neutralized over 80,000 members of the Viet Cong infrastructure. The breakdown was approximately 20% killed, 20% captured, and 60% defected or otherwise removed from the network. These numbers were used to demonstrate effectiveness. They were also, by the accounts of program participants and independent investigators, substantially falsified. The program operated under the same body count incentive structure that corrupted conventional military reporting. Provincial reconnaissance units, the paramilitary teams that conducted Phoenix operations, were compensated partly based on the number of targets they neutralized. The result was predictable. People with no connection to the Viet Cong infrastructure were killed and counted. Personal vendettas were settled under the program's authority. Individuals were denounced by neighbors or rivals and added to target lists without adequate verification. The program's own internal standards required corroboration from multiple sources before an individual could be designated a target, but those standards were routinely bypassed. William Colby, the CIA officer who ran the Phoenix program and later became CIA director, testified before Congress in 1971 that the program was not an assassination program. He was technically correct in the narrowest sense. It was a program that produced a great many deaths, some of which corresponded to actual Viet Cong operatives and many of which did not, and whose statistics were constructed to tell whatever story was most useful at a given moment. The relationship between American forces and the South Vietnamese population they were theoretically protecting was one of the war's most persistently misrepresented realities. The official framework was clear. Americans and South Vietnamese were allies, sharing a common cause against communist aggression from the North. The actual relationship on the ground was considerably more complicated and considerably darker. The pacification program that was supposed to win the hearts and minds of the rural population was operating in villages that had been bombed, defoliated, relocated, and searched. The strategic hamlet program of the early 1960s had forcibly relocated millions of Vietnamese farmers from their ancestral villages into newly constructed settlements surrounded by wire and watchtowers. The theory was that this would separate the population from the insurgents. The reality was that it generated enormous resentment, destroyed the agricultural patterns that sustained rural life, and in many cases created exactly the conditions of alienation that facilitated recruitment into the insurgency. When the strategic hamlet program was eventually abandoned as a failure, it was not replaced with a better theory, but with a more intensive version of the same approach, minus the villages. Instead of relocating the population, the military began designating entire regions as free fire zones. areas where anyone present could be assumed to be hostile, and engaged accordingly. The concept of the free fire zone formalized what had been happening informally for years. The treatment of civilian presence in contested areas as presumptive evidence of enemy affiliation. The defoliation program, conducted under Operation Ranch Hand, sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicide over South Vietnam between 1962 and 1971. The primary agent was Agent Orange, a mixture of two herbicides contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds known to chemistry. The stated purpose was to deny the enemy forest cover and to destroy crops that might be feeding enemy forces. The actual effects extended far beyond these military objectives. Approximately 5 million acres of forest and 1 million acres of cropland were destroyed. The Vietnamese farmers whose crops were sprayed were not enemy combatants. They were civilians attempting to grow food in a country that was simultaneously being bombed and defoliated. The long-term health consequences of dioxin exposure were not fully understood at the time the program began. But by the mid-1960s, there was internal government knowledge of potential toxicity that was not shared with the public, not shared with the soldiers who were flying the missions, and not shared with the Vietnamese population being sprayed. The Veterans Administration spent years after the war resisting claims from American veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange and developed cancers and other conditions associated with dioxin. The resistance was not based on scientific uncertainty. It was based on liability. The internal documents showing that the government had known about potential risks were not released for years. The Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange, whose exposure was far more extensive than that of American veterans, were not acknowledged as victims at all by the American government. The herbicide companies that produced Agent Orange reached a settlement with American veterans in 1984. The Vietnamese government did not receive a comparable acknowledgement for decades. The question of who exactly was fighting on the other side of this war was also more complicated than American officials wanted to acknowledge. The standard framing divided the enemy into two categories: the North Vietnamese Army, a conventional military force backed by the Soviet Union and China, and the Viet Cong, the southern insurgency. This framing was accurate as far as it went, but it obscured the degree to which the Viet Cong were not simply puppets of Hanoi, but represented a genuine southern political movement with deep roots in the population, roots that predated American involvement, and that could not be destroyed by military force without destroying the population itself. It also obscured the degree to which the war's trajectory was being shaped not just by military force, but by political developments in Saigon that American policy was simultaneously influencing and being influenced by. The South Vietnamese government was not a reliable partner. It was a succession of regimes, some elected in forms, some produced by coups, some sustained only by American support, each of which had its own interests that did not always align with American interests, and none of which had succeeded in building the kind of political legitimacy that could have formed the foundation for a durable peace. The series of coups that followed the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in November 1963 is a case study in the gap between American strategic ambition and operational reality. Diem had been South Vietnam's first president, installed with American support after the Geneva Accords of 1954. By 1963, he had become a political liability, alienating the Buddhist majority through policies that favored his own Catholic minority, conducting a brutal suppression of Buddhist protests that generated international condemnation, and pursuing the war in ways that American advisors found increasingly ineffective. The Kennedy administration signaled to South Vietnamese military officers that it would not oppose a change in government. The signal was sent through Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge and through CIA channels. What followed was a coup in which Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu were captured and murdered. The Kennedy administration claimed surprise at the murders, though the historical record makes clear that American officials had known that Diem's removal would almost certainly be followed by his death. What followed the coup was not stability. It was a period of extreme political instability in which South Vietnam experienced a succession of governments, none capable of building popular support, all dependent on American backing, all conducting the war in ways that served their internal political needs as much as or more than their military objectives. By the time the Johnson administration took over and began the massive escalation of 1965, the political foundation that military force was supposed to be protecting had already been so thoroughly undermined that it was not clear what exactly the war was being fought to preserve. The soldiers who arrived in Vietnam after 1965 arrived into this reality without being told most of it. They knew they were fighting communism. They knew they were supposed to be defending South Vietnam. They did not know, in most cases, the history of the coups, the details of the body count inflation, the internal debates about whether the war was winnable that were already well advanced within the Pentagon and the State Department before the first large-scale deployments began. They knew what they were told in training, which was that they were serving a vital national interest in a dangerous place. And then they arrived. The gap between the briefings and the reality was not subtle. Soldiers who had been told they were defending a friendly population discovered that the population's friendliness was at best ambiguous and at worst openly hostile. Soldiers who had been told the enemy was being degraded by constant attrition discovered that the enemy seemed to be everywhere, that killing 100 fighters in a firefight did not seem to reduce the number of fighters encountered the following week. Soldiers who had been told that the metrics of success were improving discovered that the metrics were being constructed to show improvement regardless of what was actually happening. The rotation policy contributed to this disorientation in ways that were not fully appreciated at the time. American soldiers served one-year tours in Vietnam. The policy was intended to spread the burden of combat service and to maintain morale by giving each soldier a defined end date. The effect, unintended but significant, was to prevent the accumulation of institutional knowledge within units. By the time a soldier had learned enough about the terrain, the enemy's tactics, the local population's dynamics, and the specific geography of his operational area to be genuinely effective, his tour was nearly over. He was replaced by someone starting from zero. Units were constantly cycling through a learning curve that never reached its apex. The institutional knowledge that should have accumulated within units instead dissipated with each rotation. Officers served even shorter command tours, typically 6 months in command of a battalion or brigade, because the career incentive structure rewarded having a command tour on one's record rather than performing effectively in one. The result was a rotation of commanders who were perpetually adjusting to new environments and who had strong career incentives to produce positive results quickly, regardless of whether those results were sustainable. The drug culture that developed among American soldiers in Vietnam is widely acknowledged now, but was systematically underreported during the war itself. By the late 1960s, high-grade heroin was available in Vietnam at prices and purity levels that bore no resemblance to what was available on American streets. The heroin was supplied in part through networks connected to the South Vietnamese government and military, networks that American officials were aware of, and that intersected in complex ways with the CIA's relationships with various factions in the region. A 1971 congressional report estimated that between 10 and 15% of American soldiers in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. The actual number may have been higher. The Army's response, when it finally responded, was to institute a urine testing program before soldiers rotated home, which created a perverse incentive. Soldiers who were heroin users switched to other drugs that cleared their systems faster, often marijuana or amphetamines, and returned to heroin after leaving Vietnam. The drug problem was not simply a symptom of individual weakness or poor character. It was a response to a specific environment, one characterized by fear, boredom, moral injury, unclear objectives, and the persistent knowledge that what one was doing might not matter. The drug use was also, in many cases, tacitly permitted by command structures that found it preferable to overt resistance. A soldier who was high was not a soldier who was fragging his officers. Fragging. The word entered the military lexicon in Vietnam. It referred to the use of fragmentation grenades to kill or injure American officers or NCOs by their own troops. The practice began appearing in significant numbers around 1969 and continued through the early 1970s, paralleling the broader collapse of unit cohesion and discipline that characterized the late war period. The documented incidents represent only a fraction of what actually occurred. Many fragging incidents were logged as accidents. Others were never investigated. The number of confirmed fragging incidents totaled in the hundreds, with death tolls in the dozens. But the significance of fragging was not primarily in the numbers. It was in what the numbers represented: a breakdown of the fundamental relationship between soldiers and the command structure that sustained military organization. When soldiers are killing their own officers, the Army as a functioning institution is in serious trouble. The Army knew this. The response was to manage the information rather than the underlying conditions. Reports of fragging incidents were classified or minimized. The press was given limited access to information about them. When the scale of the problem became publicly known, it was contextualized as a discipline problem, a symptom of the anti-war movement's influence on the military, rather than as a rational, if extreme, response to an environment in which officers were sending men on missions that seemed designed to produce body count numbers, rather than to accomplish anything strategically meaningful. The anti-war movement within the military itself is another story that received less attention than its civilian counterpart. By 1970 and 1971, underground newspapers were circulating on American military bases in Vietnam with names like Kill for Peace and GI Says. These publications documented abuses, criticized policy, and provided a forum for soldiers to express views that were officially forbidden. Officers who tried to suppress them were sometimes doing so in direct contradiction to the First Amendment rights that the military was theoretically defending. The GI movement, as it became known, included soldiers who refused orders, soldiers who organized unofficial strikes, and soldiers who testified before congressional committees about what they had witnessed and participated in. The Winter Soldier Investigation of 1971, organized by Vietnam veterans against the war, produced testimony from more than 100 veterans describing war crimes, atrocities, and systematic violations of the laws of war. The testimony was detailed, consistent, and corroborated by internal military documents. It received minimal mainstream press coverage. The veterans who testified were investigated by military intelligence, their records scrutinized for vulnerabilities, their credibility attacked through official channels. Some of the testimony was challenged on procedural grounds. None of it was refuted on factual grounds. The air war conducted over North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia during this period represents a chapter of destruction whose scale is still not fully absorbed into public consciousness. The total tonnage of bombs dropped by American forces during the Vietnam War exceeded the total tonnage dropped by all sides during World War II. The bombing of Laos, conducted largely in secret, made Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in human history. The bombing of Cambodia, authorized by President Nixon in 1969, without congressional knowledge or public disclosure, targeted North Vietnamese supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but caused extensive civilian casualties and contributed directly to the political destabilization that eventually brought the Khmer Rouge to power. The internal deliberations about these bombing campaigns reveal a consistent pattern. Decision-makers were aware that civilian casualties were occurring on a significant scale, and chose to continue the campaigns because the military and political benefits were assessed to outweigh the costs. The assessments of military benefit were, in many cases, also fabricated. The strategic bombing of North Vietnam, conducted across multiple campaigns from 1965 to 1968 and again in 1972, failed to achieve its stated objectives of interdicting supply lines and breaking North Vietnamese will. Detailed post-war analysis confirmed what a number of analysts had predicted before the campaigns began. that a largely agricultural economy with dispersed infrastructure and a determined population could absorb bombing on a massive scale without suffering the kind of industrial collapse that strategic bombing theory was premised upon. The internal assessments that reached this conclusion were not transmitted upward through the chain of command in forms that would have challenged the continued prosecution of the campaigns. The CIA's role in the war extended far beyond the Phoenix program. The agency had been involved in Vietnamese affairs since the early 1950s, when it had worked with the Saigon military mission under Colonel Edward Lansdale to conduct psychological operations and build anti-communist networks in the North in the years after the Geneva Partition. The agency had relationships with Montagnard tribal groups in the Central Highlands, whom it organized into irregular forces under the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program. It had relationships with various political factions in Saigon, whose internal power struggles periodically destabilized the government the United States was supposedly trying to support. It had involvement with Air America, the proprietary airline that transported personnel and supplies throughout Southeast Asia, and that was credibly accused in subsequent investigations of having facilitated the transport of opium produced by tribal groups in Laos, whose cooperation the agency was cultivating. The relationship between CIA assets, the drug trade, and the broader political economy of the war is one of the most thoroughly documented and consistently minimized aspects of the conflict. Alfred McCoy's 1972 book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, documented the connections in detail that provoked both denials from the CIA and an internal agency review that was never made public. The connections are not speculative. They are documented in congressional testimony, in declassified cables, and in the accounts of agency officers who participated in the relevant programs, and who, in some cases, expressed discomfort with what they were being asked to facilitate. The treatment of prisoners of war, both American prisoners held by North Vietnam and prisoners captured by American and South Vietnamese forces, represents another area where the gap between official statements and operational reality was substantial. The torture of American prisoners held at the Hanoi Hilton and other North Vietnamese facilities is documented and acknowledged. Less discussed is the systematic torture of prisoners held by South Vietnamese forces under American supervision. The use of water torture, electric shock, and other coercive interrogation techniques was widespread and well documented by American military advisors who observed and in some cases participated. The International Control Commission, established under the Geneva Accords to monitor compliance, received numerous reports of prisoner abuse and found its access to detention facilities restricted by both South Vietnamese authorities and their American advisors. The standard American response to reports of prisoner abuse by South Vietnamese forces was that these were South Vietnamese facilities operating under South Vietnamese authority. This was technically true and substantively misleading. American advisors were present. American money funded the facilities. American intelligence used the information extracted in them. The legal and moral responsibility was distributed in ways that allowed each party to point at the other. The use of civilians as human shields, the execution of prisoners, the destruction of villages as collective punishment for suspected Viet Cong sympathy. These were not aberrations. They were patterns. The documentation in court-martial records, congressional investigations, and journalistic accounts is extensive enough that the pattern nature of these behaviors is not seriously disputed by serious historians of the war. What is disputed is the question of systemic versus individual responsibility, the question of whether these behaviors reflected policy or reflected the breakdown of policy. The answer, in the most honest reading of the available evidence, is that the distinction between policy and breakdown of policy was itself part of the misrepresentation. Policies that produced foreseeable results and then characterized those results as breakdowns were functioning as designed. The rules of engagement were written in ways that gave tactical commanders enormous discretion. That discretion was exercised in an environment of institutional pressure to produce results, to minimize American casualties, and to treat civilian presence in contested areas as presumptively hostile. The results that followed from these conditions were predictable. They were also repeatedly attributed to individual failure rather than systemic design. The electronic sensors deployed along what was known as the McNamara line represent a particular kind of institutional fantasy. The line, formerly known as the Infiltration Surveillance Center, was an attempt to apply the logic of industrial management to the problem of infiltration across the Vietnamese demilitarized zone and through Laos. An array of acoustic and seismic sensors would be dropped from aircraft, detect movement, and transmit signals to a processing center at Nakhon Phanom in Thailand, where computers would analyze the data and direct strikes against detected movement. The system cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It was developed by some of the most technically sophisticated defense contractors in the United States, and it produced data that was, by the accounts of the pilots who flew the strikes directed by it, largely divorced from military reality. The sensors detected movement, certainly. They detected movement of water buffalo, of civilians on foot, of animals of all varieties. The bombing missions directed by the sensor data struck many things. Whether those things were North Vietnamese supply convoys was much less certain than the system's outputs suggested. The system continued operating and being funded long after its limitations were understood internally, because it represented an enormous institutional investment, and because the alternative to claiming it worked was admitting that a core element of the war's technological strategy was a failure. The peace negotiations that eventually produced the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were not, in any straightforward sense, an honest attempt by all parties to end the war. Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho conducted the talks that produced the agreement, for which they were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, an award that Tho refused and that prompted 2 members of the Nobel Committee to resign in protest. The agreement included provisions for a ceasefire, for the withdrawal of American forces, and for the return of American prisoners of war. It did not include, despite public characterizations to the contrary, a genuine settlement of the underlying political conflict. It included a vague commitment to political processes that all parties understood would not be honored. Nixon and Kissinger privately assured South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu that the United States would provide continued military support if North Vietnam violated the agreement. Those assurances were given knowing that Congress was in the process of limiting the administration's ability to make them good. The agreement was, in the assessment of many participants and most subsequent analysts, primarily a mechanism for extracting American forces and prisoners while leaving the underlying conflict unresolved. Kissinger himself described it privately, in terms that later leaked, as giving South Vietnam a decent interval before its probable fall. The decent interval lasted until April 1975. The final fall of Saigon on April 29 and 30, 1975, produced images that entered the permanent visual vocabulary of American history. The helicopter on the roof of the CIA compound, the crowds pressing against the embassy gates, the last flights out. What those images did not show was the $17 billion in military equipment the United States had transferred to South Vietnam, much of which fell into North Vietnamese hands or was abandoned. They did not show the South Vietnamese military officers and officials who had been promised American support and who were now facing capture. They did not show the tens of thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with American forces and the intelligence services and who were left behind. Operation Frequent Wind, the final evacuation, extracted approximately 7,000 American citizens and South Vietnamese. Hundreds of thousands of others who had reason to fear the new government did not get out. Many of them spent years in re-education camps. Many of them died in those camps. The chaos of the final days was not purely a function of circumstances. It was a function of the failure to plan adequately for an outcome that had been, on the available evidence, highly probable for years. Planning for an evacuation would have required acknowledging publicly that South Vietnam might fall, which would have been politically inconvenient, so the planning was not done with the thoroughness that the situation demanded. The soldiers who came home from Vietnam returned to a country that did not know what to do with them. The veteran benefits infrastructure that had been built for the generation that fought World War II was not adapted to receive men who had served in an unpopular war, many of whom were dealing with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, but which the medical and military establishments of the 1970s were largely unwilling to acknowledge as a legitimate diagnostic category. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not appear in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until 1980, after years of advocacy by Vietnam veterans and the clinicians who treated them. Before that, the symptoms that veterans were experiencing were classified under various other headings or classified not at all. Veterans who sought treatment were often told that their symptoms reflected character weakness rather than injury. Veterans who described what they had done and seen were sometimes disbelieved or dismissed. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans was significantly elevated above the general population, a fact that the Veterans Administration tracked without for many years, responding to adequately. The Agent Orange compensation battle, the recognition of PTSD, the acknowledgement of the specific injuries sustained by veterans of this specific war took decades and required veterans to fight institutional resistance that, in retrospect, looks like an attempt to manage liability rather than to acknowledge responsibility. The classified operations conducted in Laos and Cambodia during the war years represent a sustained exercise in official deception that was not fully acknowledged for decades. Operation Menu, the secret bombing of Cambodia that began in March 1969, was conducted under a dual reporting system in which two sets of records were kept. The real records showing the actual targets and the falsified records showing fictional targets inside South Vietnam. The falsification was deliberate, systematic, and ordered from the chain of command rather than improvised by individual units. When the bombing was eventually acknowledged publicly, the administration characterized it as a military necessity that had been kept secret for security reasons. The more honest characterization is that it was kept secret because it was illegal under the terms of the congressional authorizations that governed military operations, and because it involved the bombing of a neutral country whose sovereignty the United States was formally committed to respecting. The bombing of Laos under Operation Barrel Roll and Steel Tiger, conducted from 1964 onward, remained classified for years after the bombing of Cambodia became public. The scale of the Laotian bombing, ultimately more than 2 million tons of ordnance, produced a landscape of unexploded cluster munitions that continues to kill and maim civilians in Laos today, more than half a century after the last bombs fell. The role of the press in constructing the public's understanding of the war is itself a complex and contested history. The early years of American involvement under Kennedy and in the first years of Johnson's presidency were covered by a small number of journalists who were often skeptical of official military assessments and who reported on the gaps between what they were being told and what they were observing. David Halberstam of the New York Times, Neil Sheehan of the United Press International, and Malcolm Brown of the Associated Press were among reporters who, in 1962 and 1963, wrote stories that challenged the optimistic assessments being provided by the military command. The Kennedy administration pressured the Times to reassign Halberstam. The pressure failed, but the structural constraints on war journalism were significant and were shaped by factors beyond official pressure. Journalists depended on the military for access and for physical safety. Reporters who wrote stories that made the military look bad found that access became more difficult. The system of press pools, official briefings, and embedded access that governed coverage in later wars had its precursor in Vietnam, and the constraints it created were understood and accommodated by most of the press corps most of the time. The images of combat that appeared in American living rooms each evening were selected, edited, and contextualized in ways that reflected both the genuine courage of combat cameramen and the structural limitations of what they were able to capture and what editors were willing to show. The particular story of the 173rd Airborne Brigade at the Battle of Dak To in November 1967 illustrates the persistent gap between what was reported and what was experienced. The battle was among the largest and most intense conventional engagements of the war to that point. American forces, along with South Vietnamese units, fought North Vietnamese Army regulars for 3 weeks on a series of jungle-covered hills. The final engagement, for control of Hill 875, produced some of the highest single-engagement casualty rates of the war. 289 Americans were killed. The battle was reported in the American press as a significant American victory, as evidence that the enemy was being forced to stand and fight on American terms and was suffering devastating losses in the process. This was the framing provided by MACV and by the Johnson administration, which needed the story to support its claim that the war was going well. The soldiers who had fought on Hill 875, those who survived it, had a different understanding. They had watched men die on a hill that they then left. The North Vietnamese had chosen the time and place of engagement, had inflicted high casualties on American forces, and had then withdrawn in good order. The hill was abandoned after its capture because it had no strategic value that justified holding it. A hill that American soldiers had died to take was returned to the jungle within weeks. This pattern, engage, take casualties, take the objective, withdraw from the objective, recur, was a central feature of the war that the body count metric was specifically designed to obscure. Westmoreland could point to the number of enemy dead at Dak To. He could not easily explain why the same hills would need to be fought over again. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 is generally understood as the moment the credibility gap became unbridgeable, the moment when the Johnson administration's optimistic public assessments collided with television images of Viet Cong fighters inside the American embassy compound in Saigon. But the significance of Tet was more specific than the general narrative suggests. The offensive was a military failure for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese in narrow tactical terms. The popular uprising that the Viet Cong leadership had expected to accompany the offensive did not materialize. American and South Vietnamese forces repelled the attacks in most locations within days or weeks. Though the battle for the city of Hue lasted 3 weeks and involved some of the most intense urban combat of the war, the Viet Cong infrastructure in the south was decimated as large numbers of experienced fighters who had maintained cover were exposed and killed. In military terms, the offensive set back the insurgency significantly, but the political impact in the United States was decisive in ways that had nothing to do with the military outcome. The images of fighting in Saigon, coming just months after Westmoreland had made his famous statement that he was optimistic and that there was light at the end of the tunnel, demonstrated that the official picture of the war's progress was false. It was not that Tet proved the war was being lost. It was that Tet proved the public had been lied to about the state of the war. The trust that had sustained public support for the war was not destroyed by military failure. It was destroyed by the revelation of systematic misrepresentation. Johnson announced in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election. The announcement ended one political career. It did not end the war. The Phoenix program's targeting of civilians, beyond the inflated statistics already described, involved a specific dynamic that is worth examining in detail. The program operated through district and provincial offices staffed by South Vietnamese officials who had their own political agendas, their own personal rivalries, and their own relationships with the local power structures that the program was supposed to be dismantling. American advisors at the provincial level often knew that the targeting lists they were working from were unreliable. Some of them documented this in internal reports that went upward through the advisory chain and were not acted upon. The program's requirement to produce numbers meant that targets were found regardless of their actual connection to the Viet Cong infrastructure. In some provinces, the program functioned as a mechanism for eliminating political opponents of local officials rather than as an intelligence-driven counterinsurgency tool. The CIA officers who ran the program at the national level were aware of these problems. They attempted to address them through more rigorous targeting criteria and through the replacement of particularly problematic South Vietnamese officials. These efforts produced marginal improvements in some provinces and no improvement in others. The program continued to be presented to Congress and to the public as a precision instrument targeting the communist political network, when it was, in significant parts of the country, an indiscriminate generator of civilian casualties and a provider of false statistics. The specific mechanics of how the war was reported within the military hierarchy deserve more attention than they typically receive. An officer commanding a platoon or company in the field would file after-action reports that became the raw material for higher-level assessments. Those reports were not independent documents. They were written by officers who understood the institutional context in which they would be read, who knew that certain kinds of information would be well received and other kinds would raise uncomfortable questions. The incentive to shade ambiguous situations in favorable directions, to classify deaths as enemy combatants when their status was unclear, to attribute positive outcomes to command decisions and negative outcomes to enemy actions or weather or terrain, was not the result of individual dishonesty. It was the product of a reporting system that rewarded favorable reports and penalized unfavorable ones. The cumulative effect of thousands of such reports, aggregated through successive levels of command, was an institutional picture of the war that bore a systematically optimistic relationship to reality. This was known. It was discussed in internal reviews. There were periodic efforts to improve the accuracy of reporting, efforts that produced temporary improvements and then faded. The system's structural incentives were more powerful than the efforts to correct them. The Marine Corps' Combined Action Program represented one of the few genuine attempts to conduct the war differently, to embed small Marine units in Vietnamese villages and to focus on population security rather than attrition. The program produced better results by most measures than the conventional search and destroy approach. It built relationships with village populations, reduced Viet Cong influence in the villages where it operated, and sustained lower casualty rates among its participants than conventional units of similar size. Military historians who have studied it generally regard it as one of the more effective counterinsurgency approaches of the war. The program was never expanded beyond a relatively small scale, partly because it did not produce the kind of body counts that the command structure used to measure progress, and partly because it required the sustained commitment of small units to specific geographic areas rather than the mobile, large unit operations that Westmoreland preferred. It was a different theory of the war, and the command structure found the evidence that it worked less compelling than the institutional momentum behind the approach it was already using. The specific experiences of African American soldiers in Vietnam add another dimension to the war's internal contradictions. African Americans were drafted in disproportionate numbers in the early years of the war, partly because the college deferment system that allowed middle-class white men to avoid service was less accessible to working-class black men. They served in combat units at higher rates than their overall share of military service would have predicted, and they died at correspondingly higher rates. The military was formally desegregated, but the informal hierarchies of American racial life were reproduced in its culture and in the distribution of dangerous assignments, of decorations, and of career advancement. African American soldiers who were disciplined for acts of resistance or protest were more likely to receive severe punishments than white soldiers who engaged in comparable behavior. The military's equal opportunity programs, formally initiated in 1971 after the scale of racial tension within the military had become impossible to ignore, addressed some of these disparities and were largely ineffective at others. The racial politics of the Vietnam War, the specific intersection of the civil rights movement, the draft, and the war's conduct, is a thread that runs through the entire history of the conflict and that was systematically marginalized in official accounts that preferred to present the military as a functioning meritocracy. The tunnels of Cu Chi represented a physical manifestation of the gap between American military power and operational effectiveness. The tunnel complex, developed over decades of guerrilla warfare, extended for hundreds of miles beneath the Iron Triangle northwest of Saigon. It included hospitals, armories, living quarters, command centers, and storage facilities. American forces spent years trying to destroy it. They flooded it. They pumped in tear gas. They sent tunnel rats, small soldiers specially trained to enter and clear tunnels, into its passages, where they fought in darkness with pistols and knives. They bombed the surface above it with everything from tactical aircraft to B-52 arc light strikes that left the Earth looking as though it had been turned over by some enormous plow. The tunnel complex survived. It was not simply durable, it was adaptive. When one section was destroyed, others were deepened, rerouted, reinforced. The complex was not primarily a military installation. It was the physical expression of a determination that American firepower could damage and disrupt, but could not break. The soldiers who fought above it, who died above it, were engaged in a task that the available tools were not adequate to complete. This inadequacy was known and was documented. It did not change the approach. The specific case of the Army's suppression of the Piers report findings illustrates how accountability mechanisms were designed to contain rather than address institutional problems. After the Piers investigation confirmed the scope of the My Lai massacre and the subsequent cover-up, the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps brought charges against 28 individuals. The cases proceeded unevenly. Some were dismissed for lack of evidence. Some were dismissed on procedural grounds. The trial of Captain Ernest Medina, Charlie Company's commander, resulted in acquittal. The trial of Lieutenant William Calley, the officer most directly implicated in ordering the killings, resulted in conviction, but produced an extraordinary political intervention. President Nixon personally ordered that Calley be released from military prison pending appeal and placed under house arrest. The intervention was framed as a response to public sympathy for Calley, who had been constructed in some quarters as a scapegoat for a failed war. It was also, objectively, an interference in a military judicial proceeding that compromised the integrity of whatever accountability the proceeding was attempting to provide. The officers who had covered up the massacre were never prosecuted. The commanders who had created the conditions that produced it faced no legal consequences. The system produced one conviction and then arranged for that conviction's consequences to be minimized. The specific role of electronic warfare and signals intelligence in Vietnam produced its own set of institutional distortions. The National Security Agency's operations in the region, conducted from listening posts in Thailand and from aircraft and ships offshore, generated enormous volumes of signals intelligence that was fed into the targeting and operational planning systems. The intelligence was sometimes accurate and sometimes not, and the difficulty of distinguishing between the two in real time contributed to a number of significant operational failures, including, most consequentially, the Gulf of Tonkin incident of August 1964. The claimed second attack on American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, the attack that Johnson used to obtain the congressional resolution that became the legal basis for the massive escalation of the war, almost certainly did not occur. The NSA's own signals intelligence, declassified in a 2005 internal history, documented that the intelligence analysis supporting the claimed second attack was manipulated, that analysts who raised doubts about the attack's occurrence were overruled, and that the reports transmitted to Washington described an attack that the analysts themselves were uncertain about. Johnson knew there were doubts. McNamara knew there were doubts. The resolution was obtained anyway. The legal and political foundation for the war's massive escalation was constructed on an event that probably did not happen, on the basis of intelligence that was known at the time to be uncertain. The specific experience of the 1st Cavalry Division's air assault operations illustrates the war's characteristic cycle of tactical success and strategic futility. The Ia Drang campaign of November 1965 was the first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese Army forces. The battle, particularly at Landing Zone X-Ray and the subsequent catastrophe at Landing Zone Albany, demonstrated both the potential and the limits of airmobile warfare. At X-Ray, American troops under Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore held a landing zone against repeated assaults by North Vietnamese forces, inflicting heavy casualties. At Albany, a column of American soldiers moving through tall grass was ambushed and nearly destroyed, with over 100 Americans killed. The overall campaign was claimed as a victory by MACV. The North Vietnamese drew different lessons. The Ia Drang validated their strategy of engaging American forces at close range, where American firepower advantages were reduced and where high American casualties could be inflicted, even in engagements that were technically American victories. The North Vietnamese willingness to absorb enormous casualties in engagements they chose, on terrain they chose, at times they chose, was the operational reality that the body count metric was specifically unsuited to capture. Killing a large number of North Vietnamese soldiers in an engagement that the North Vietnamese had initiated at a time and place of their choosing was not evidence of American strategic advantage. It was evidence of North Vietnamese strategic patience. The specific history of the Brown Water Navy, the riverine forces that operated in the Mekong Delta, provides another angle on the war's institutional contradictions. The mobile riverine force, established in 1967, was an attempt to bring military power to bear in the waterways of the Delta, a region characterized by dense civilian population, complex waterway networks, and deep Viet Cong presence. The force operated under rules of engagement that were supposed to prevent civilian casualties, but that in practice were extremely difficult to apply in an environment where the distinction between civilian and combatant was almost impossible to maintain on a rapidly moving river in darkness or under fire. Incidents in which riverine forces fired on civilian craft, civilian fishing boats, civilian cargo vessels were documented repeatedly in after-action reports and in congressional testimony. The response to these incidents was typically to note that the rules of engagement had been reviewed and were being strictly applied. The incidents continued. The rules of engagement were not the problem. The problem was the environment. The intersection of a military mission premised on distinguishing friends from enemies in a population where that distinction was not reliably available. The last major American offensive operations in Vietnam were conducted as American forces were already in the process of withdrawal, under a policy that Nixon called Vietnamization, the transfer of the war to South Vietnamese forces with continued American air support and advisory presence. The offensive operations of this period were conducted partly to support the Vietnamization process, to give South Vietnamese forces experience, and to degrade North Vietnamese capabilities before the American withdrawal was complete. They were also conducted to support Nixon's negotiating position in Paris to demonstrate American and South Vietnamese strength at the table. Lam Son 719, the South Vietnamese ground invasion of Laos in early 1971, was supposed to demonstrate that Vietnamization was working, that South Vietnamese forces could conduct major offensive operations with American air support, but without American ground troops. The operation was a disaster. South Vietnamese forces, poorly planned and poorly supported, encountered fierce North Vietnamese resistance in Laos and were forced into a chaotic retreat that was documented in graphic television footage of South Vietnamese soldiers clinging to helicopter skids as the aircraft attempted to evacuate them. The footage contradicted everything the administration had been saying about Vietnamization's progress. The administration characterized the operation as a qualified success. The characterization required a definition of success that bore no relationship to any conventional military standard. The evacuation of Saigon in April 1975 was not simply the end of a war. It was the end of a set of institutional fictions that had been maintained for more than a decade. The South Vietnamese government, whose resilience and capacity had been the premise of American strategy, collapsed with a speed that surprised those who had constructed the optimistic assessments on which policy was based, and surprised far fewer of those who had been in the country and had understood what the assessments were actually measuring. The North Vietnamese offensive that began in the spring of 1975 moved faster than anyone in Washington had publicly predicted. Though there were intelligence assessments that had warned of exactly this possibility, and that had not been transmitted through the policy process in forms that would have required their implications to be addressed. The Ford administration, constrained by congressional restrictions on military involvement that had been enacted in response to Nixon's secret bombing campaigns, could not deliver the military support that Thieu had been promised and that Nixon's private assurances had led him to expect. The American soldiers who came home, those who had served in the later years of the war particularly, returned to a country that had moved on in its own way, that had processed the war into a political argument between those who had opposed it and those who had supported it, and that had not fully reckoned with what had actually happened in the country they had fought in. The veterans' accounts did not fit cleanly into either political narrative. Those who had witnessed or participated in atrocities were not simply villains any more than those who had served with integrity and care were simply heroes. They were men who had been placed in specific institutional and environmental conditions and who had responded to those conditions in the range of ways that human beings respond to extreme pressure, moral injury, fear, boredom, grief, and the persistent knowledge that what they were doing might not matter. The institutions that had placed them in those conditions had not been honest with them about what the conditions were or what they were for. The institutions had not been honest with the American public either, and the institutions had, in significant measure, not been honest with themselves. The names that appear in Vietnam War histories tend to be the names of commanders and politicians, the names that appear on official documents and in congressional testimony and on the covers of memoirs. The names of the soldiers who walked the paddies and the hills, who made the small decisions that, aggregated across thousands of patrols and hundreds of firefights and dozens of massacres, constituted the actual texture of the war, mostly do not appear. They are present in after-action reports and in medical records and in court-martial files and in the records of the Veterans Administration, documents that are read by researchers and not by the general public. The history of what they did and what was done to them is available in those documents to anyone who looks for it. It is not a secret. It is just not the version of the history that circulates most widely, that gets made into films and documentaries and museum exhibits and the conversations people have when they think about what Vietnam was. The war ended, in the American sense of ending, in 1975. It did not end for the people who had been in it. The Vietnamese government that took power after April 30th, 1975, conducted a systematic program of detention and re-education for hundreds of thousands of people associated with the former South Vietnamese government and military. The conditions in the re-education camps were harsh, and significant numbers of detainees died in them. The boat people exodus of the late 1970s and 1980s, in which hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled the country by sea at enormous personal risk, was a direct consequence of the new government's policies and of the specific conditions that those policies created for the people who had been on the losing side of the war. The American government's response to the boat people crisis was shaped by the political awkwardness of acknowledging the human costs of the communist victory that American policy had failed to prevent. The crisis was addressed eventually through international resettlement programs in ways that required considerable political effort and considerable time. The specific chemical legacy of the war, the dioxin contamination from Agent Orange, continued accumulating in Vietnamese soil and in the bodies of Vietnamese people for generations after the last American soldier left the country. The Vietnamese Ministry of Health has documented elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, and other health conditions in areas that were heavily sprayed. The science of dioxin's health effects is complex and contested in some details. But the broad conclusion that exposure to the dioxin contaminant in Agent Orange causes serious health consequences is supported by extensive epidemiological evidence. The Dow Chemical Company and Monsanto, which were the primary manufacturers of Agent Orange, settled the class action lawsuit brought by American veterans in 1984 without admitting liability. The Vietnamese victims brought their own lawsuit in American federal court in 2004. The case was dismissed. The appeals were denied. The legal principle established was that the use of Agent Orange was within the scope of lawful wartime activity. The dioxin remained in the soil. The unexploded ordnance problem in Laos is a specific, continuing daily reality for the people who live there. Cluster bombs, delivered in the hundreds of millions during the bombing campaigns of the 1960s and 1970s, release submunitions that are designed to scatter over wide areas and that have failure rates that leave significant proportions of them unexploded on landing. In the decades since the bombing ended, these submunitions have killed and maimed thousands of Laotian civilians, the majority of them children who encounter the small, sometimes brightly colored objects while playing or working in fields. American demining assistance to Laos has been provided in varying amounts over the years, amounts that are dwarfed by the scale of the problem and by the amount spent on the bombing campaigns that created it. The problem will continue for generations. The children who will be killed by it have not yet been born. The specific documentary record of the war, the classified files, the after-action reports, the intelligence assessments, the internal communications, has been released in pieces over the decades since the war ended, through Freedom of Information Act requests, through congressional investigations, through the normal declassification process. Each release produces new information about specific events and about the general pattern of misrepresentation. None of it fundamentally changes the picture for people who have been paying attention. The pattern was visible, in broad outline, from the war's own period. It was documented by journalists, by dissident military officers, by congressional investigators, by veterans who testified at Winter Soldier and at congressional hearings and in memoirs. The information was available. It was available in forms that, if taken seriously and acted upon, would have required institutional change that institutions are structurally resistant to making. So the war went on. The specific experience of the soldiers who served in the final years, 1972 and 1973, after the Paris Peace Accords were signed, and while the last American forces were withdrawing, was one of extraordinary dislocation. They were still in a war zone. People were still being killed. The mission had become, in the most honest institutional terms, to facilitate a withdrawal without losing too many people in the process. The purpose that had justified the commitment, the defense of South Vietnamese independence, had been effectively abandoned in the negotiations that produced the ceasefire. The ceasefire was not being honored by either side. Soldiers were still dying in engagements that had no strategic purpose, in the literal sense that there was no strategy that their deaths served. They died anyway. The paperwork was still filed. The after-action reports were still written. The chain of command still functioned. The institutional machinery continued to operate after its justification had dissolved, because institutional machinery does not automatically stop when its justification dissolves. It continues until something from outside forces it to stop. The last American combat death in Vietnam occurred on April 29, 1975, during the final hours of the evacuation, when two Marine Guards, Corporal Charles McMahon and Lance Corporal Darwin Judge, were killed in a rocket attack at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. They were 21 and 19 years old, respectively. Their deaths occurred after the war had, in every meaningful political sense, already ended. After the decision to withdraw had been made and the evacuation was in process. They were killed by the war's continuing physical reality in the hours when its political and institutional existence was being finally terminated. Their names are on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the last two names on the last panel, positioned at the memorial's chronological end. The war had cost, by the most commonly cited estimates, approximately 58,000 American lives. It had cost, by estimates that vary depending on methodology and source, between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese lives, military and civilian, north and south, in numbers that were never tracked with the same precision that American casualties were tracked. The body count that had been the war's primary metric of progress turned out not to have measured anything that correlated with winning. The villages that had been burned, and the forests that had been defoliated, and the tunnels that had been flooded, and the hills that had been taken and abandoned, and the statistics that had been fabricated and transmitted upward through the chain of command and presented to Congress and to the public as evidence of a war being prosecuted, effectively had added up to the image of the last helicopter leaving the embassy roof and the image of North Vietnamese tanks rolling through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon on the morning of April 30th, 1975. The war had been going on for so long that the specific original purpose for which it had begun had become unclear even to the people running it. And then it ended, and the paperwork stopped being filed.